The ink was her weapon, the page her battlefield. Lady Elinor Hartwell stared at the freshly printed broadsheet in her hand, her stomach a tight knot of fury. The words, penned under the pseudonym Cato, seemed to bleed through the paper, so venomous was their intent. "It is a peculiar fancy of our modern age," the article began, its tone dripping with condescension, "to entertain the notion that the delicate sensibilities of the fairer sex are suited to the rough and tumble of political discourse. The proponents of such radical change, cloaking their destabilizing ambitions in the language of progress, would do well to remember that a vase, however beautiful, is not made to hold a sword. Its nature is to adorn, not to arm. To place the franchise in the hands of women is to fundamentally misunderstand the divine order, inviting chaos into the very heart of our homes and our nation." Elinor's knuckles were white. "A vase," she whispered to the silent, book-lined walls of her private study. Sunlight streamed through the tall window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. She was no vase. She was a mind, a will, a conviction. She was Britannia. Under that bold pseudonym, she had spent the last year crafting meticulously argued pamphlets advocating for reform, expanded education for women, changes to the property laws that rendered them legal nonentities, and most controversially, a cautious, gradual approach to female suffrage. Her arguments were logical, grounded in economic sense and appeals to British justice. Cato was her shadow, her nemesis. For every point Britannia raised, Cato was there in the following week's London Clarion to dismantle it with razor-sharp rhetoric and an unshakable faith in tradition. He was, in print, the most infuriatingly brilliant man she had never met. "He reduces an argument for basic human dignity to a metaphor about porcelain," she fumed, tossing the paper onto her desk. It was a direct rebuttal to her last piece, where she had argued that denying women the vote was taxation without representation. Cato had not only dismissed her logic but had mocked the very intelligence of the women he claimed to protect. Her lady's maid, Sarah, entered quietly. "A letter has come for you, my lady. From your brother." Elinor broke from her reverie, taking the sealed missive. She broke the wax and unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning her brother George's familiar, sprawling script. "Dearest North, I trust this finds you in good health, and not too immersed in setting the world to rights from Father's old library. I am writing from Haverthwaite Park. Lord and Lady Ashworth are hosting a house party for a fortnight, and they are most insistent that you join us. It promises to be dreadfully dull, full of political types arguing about the corn laws, but the fishing is excellent, and the company of your favorite brother should be inducement enough. Do come. I've already told them to expect you. It will do you good to get away from London's soot and your own formidable intellect for a spell. Your affectionate brother." But a country house party. The very thought was exhausting. Endless, meaningless conversation, strategic walks in the garden, and evenings spent making polite small talk with men who likely shared Cato's views. But George was right. She had been sequestered for too long, the ink of her polemics threatening to stain her very soul. A change of scenery, however tedious, might provide fresh perspective. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could gather some intelligence on the political currents flowing through the Tory elite. Knowledge was power after all. She picked up her pen, a determined glint in her eye. First, however, Britannia had a response to deliver. Sir William Devereaux, Member of Parliament for Northamptonshire, felt the familiar weight of disappointment as he read the Clarion. His own words, published under the name Cato, stared back at him. They were clever, well-constructed, and he feared utterly inadequate. He had entered politics with a fervent desire to serve, to uphold the values that had made Britain great. But the halls of Westminster were a swamp of compromise and backroom deals. His speeches, once fiery with conviction, were now often tempered by party whips and political expediency. Cato was his outlet, his pure, unvarnished voice. It was the part of him that still believed in absolute principles, in the bedrock of tradition against the shifting sands of radicalism. And then there was Britannia. The anonymous writer was a constant thorn in his side. Her arguments were not the wild, unhinged ravings of some firebrand, They were calm, reasoned, and insidiously persuasive. She wielded logic like a stiletto, finding the tiny cracks in his own philosophical armor. Last week, she had written about the economic contributions of women, pointing out the absurdity of a system that relied on their unpaid labor in the home and their underpaid labor in factories while denying them a political voice. It had been a brilliant, frustrating piece. His rebuttal about the vase felt weak even to him. It was a deflection, an appeal to emotion over reason. He had written it in a fit of pique after a particularly draining debate in the Commons. Cato was supposed to be better than that. Cato was supposed to be above such petty irritation. His man, Jenkins, cleared his throat. "Your bags are packed for Hartwell, Sir William. The carriage is ready." William sighed, folding the newspaper. Hartwell Park. A gathering hosted by Lord Ashworth, a staunch political ally. It would be a week of hunting, port, and political strategizing. A necessary evil. He needed Ashworth's support for an upcoming bill, and there was no better place to secure it than over a good claret and a better pheasant shoot. Perhaps the clean country air would clear his head. Perhaps he could find a way to silence the nagging, logical voice of Britannia that had taken up residence in his mind. Hartwell Park was every bit as grand and imposing as Elinor had remembered. The Palladian mansion sprawled across the manicured landscape, its honey-colored stone glowing in the afternoon sun. As her carriage crunched up the gravel drive, she felt a familiar sense of alienation. This was a world of inherited privilege, a world her writings as Britannia sought to gently, but fundamentally, change. Her brother George was waiting on the steps, his face breaking into a wide, welcoming grin. "Nora, you came. I was half afraid you'd send a pamphlet in your stead." She laughed, allowing him to help her down. "I considered it, but I feared the postage would be prohibitive." He led her inside, through the cavernous marble hall and into a drawing room where a dozen or so guests were taking tea. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the low murmur of polite conversation. Elinor's eyes scanned the room, automatically categorizing its inhabitants: the dowagers in their silks, the young ladies simpering behind their fans, the gentlemen discussing the state of the fields. And then her gaze fell upon him. He stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantelpiece. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled his expertly tailored coat. His hair was a dark, unruly brown, and his face was all strong lines and sharp angles, with a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He was listening to something Lord Ashworth was saying, his expression one of polite attention, but Elinor could see an intensity in his deep-set gray eyes, a sharp intelligence that was at odds with the languid surroundings. He was, without a doubt, the most compelling man she had ever seen. "Who is that?" she asked George quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "Him? That's Sir William Devereaux. Tory MP. A rising star, they say. Brilliant mind, but a bit of a hardliner. Very conservative. You'd probably despise him." George grinned. "Shall I introduce you?" Before she could refuse, George was steering her across the room. "Sir William, may I present my sister, Lady Elinor Hartwell. Elinor, Sir William Devereaux." Sir William turned his gaze upon her, and Elinor felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt, as if she had touched a stray spark from the fire. His eyes were not just gray, they were the color of a winter sea, and they held a penetrating quality that seemed to see right through her social veneer. "Lady Elinor," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the air. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, and bowed slightly. "A pleasure." "Sir William," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "My brother tells me you are in Parliament." "I have that honor," he said, a faint, polite smile touching his lips. "And you, my lady? Do you follow the political currents of our time?" It was a standard, innocuous question, the kind asked 1,000 times in drawing rooms across England. But from him, it felt like a challenge. "I take an interest as much as my sex and understanding will allow," she said, deploying the standard self-deprecating response with a slight, ironic edge that only she could detect. His gaze sharpened, as if he had caught the nuance. "I find that a lady's understanding is often far greater than she is given credit for." Though the world of politics is a rough one, full of complexities that can be unsettling. The ghost of Cato's article, the delicate sensibilities of the fairer sex, seemed to materialize between them. Perhaps it is the simplicity of the solutions offered that is more often unsettling, Sir William, she said smoothly, meeting his gaze. Complex problems rarely have simple answers. A flicker of surprise, and something that looked like interest, crossed his features. An astute observation, Lady Elinor. I shall have to remember that. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more guests, but as Elinor moved away, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back. The war of words had just found a new, and dangerously attractive, battlefield. Dinner was a protracted affair of 8 courses, each more elaborate than the last. Elinor was seated halfway down the long table, thankfully far from Sir William, who was placed near their hostess. Yet she was acutely aware of his presence throughout the meal. His laughter, deep and genuine, occasionally carried down the table. She watched him debate with an elderly earl, his gestures precise, his expressions thoughtful. He was a man who commanded attention without seeming to demand it. Later, in the drawing room, the gentlemen having rejoined the ladies after their port, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the news of the day. Someone mentioned the ongoing public debate between the 2 anonymous pamphleteers, Cato and Britannia. A most entertaining diversion, declared Lady Ashworth. Though of course, this Britannia is quite shocking. The things she proposes. I find Cato to be the more sound, said Lord Ashworth, puffing on his cigar. He understands the value of our institutions. This Britannia creature would have us tear down the very pillars of society. Elinor's cheeks grew warm. She took a sip of her tea to hide her expression. I disagree, said a quiet voice. It was Sir William. He was standing near the piano, a glass of brandy in his hand. All eyes turned to him. While I do not share Britannia's conclusions, I must admit her arguments are formidably constructed. She forces one to examine one's own principles more rigorously. It is easy to dismiss a raving radical, it is far more difficult to dismiss a logical opponent. Elinor's heart hammered against her ribs. He was praising her. No, he was praising Britannia. The disconnect was dizzying. Oh, come now, Devereaux, chortled a red-faced gentleman. You cannot admire the content. The woman is clearly unhinged. Is she? William's gaze swept the room and for a fleeting second seemed to lock with Elinor's. I admire intellect, wherever it is found. And I believe Britannia possesses a keen one. Her last piece, on the economic agency of women, was particularly provocative. There was a challenge in his voice, an invitation to debate. Elinor found her own voice, soft but clear. Do you not think, Sir William, that she has a point? If women are the moral and domestic foundation of the nation, as is so often claimed, would it not follow that their perspective could strengthen its political foundation as well? A silence fell over the room. It was not done for a young, unmarried woman to engage so directly in a political discussion, especially with a man of Sir William's stature. He looked at her, his gray eyes alight with a new, intense curiosity. He hadn't expected this from the quiet, composed lady he'd met earlier. A fair question, Lady Elinor, he said, moving slightly closer. But strength can come in many forms. Perhaps the nation's strength lies in the separation of spheres, the public and the private. A ship cannot have 2 captains. But a house cannot stand on a single pillar, she countered, her pulse racing. And is not a nation both a ship and a house? It requires both the strength to navigate turbulent waters and the stability to provide a home for its people. William stared at her, utterly captivated. This was no rehearsed drawing-room platitude. This was the heart of the debate. It was almost like arguing with Britannia herself. A compelling analogy, he conceded, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It transformed him, softening the hard lines and lighting a fire in his eyes. You have given me much to ponder, Lady Elinor. The room seemed to exhale, and conversation resumed around them. But for Elinor and William, a bubble had formed, a space charged with intellectual electricity and a strange, thrilling sense of recognition. The war of words was no longer anonymous. It had a face. And it was dangerously appealing. The following days at Hartwell were a peculiar form of torture for Elinor. She found herself seeking out Sir William's company, and he, inexplicably, seemed to seek out hers. Their conversations were a continuous, exhilarating duel. They argued during a walk through the sun-dappled woods, debating the merits of universal education. He claimed it would lead to discontent among the laboring classes. She argued that an educated populace was the bedrock of a prosperous and moral society. They sparred over the breakfast table about penal reform, their polite tones belying the fierce opposition of their views. He saw punishment as a necessary deterrent. She saw the potential for redemption and the societal cost of brutalization. Each argument was a mirror of their printed battle, yet infused with a new, personal charge. She saw the conviction in his eyes when he spoke of duty and order, and it was far more compelling than Cato's cold prose. He, in turn, was mesmerized by the quickness of her mind, the passion that lit her features when she spoke of justice and progress. She was not the shrill harpy he had imagined Britannia to be. She was grace, intelligence, and fire. For William, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Lady Elinor Hartwell was dismantling all his preconceptions. He had always believed women were intellectually inferior, or at least unsuited for the rigors of political life. Yet here was a woman whose mind could parry and thrust with his own, whose arguments were not only sound but often more nuanced than those of his colleagues in Parliament. He found himself thinking about her when he should have been focusing on courting Lord Ashworth's favor. He found himself wanting to impress her, to win her approval, even as he argued against her every point. One afternoon, a group went boating on the lake. By chance or design, Elinor and William found themselves in the same boat, him rowing with strong, steady strokes, her sitting opposite, trailing a hand in the cool water. "You are quiet today, Lady Elinor," he observed, shipping the oars for a moment and letting the boat drift. "Have I finally managed to exhaust your debating spirit?" She smiled, looking out over the tranquil water. "Not exhausted, Sir William. Perhaps contemplative. It is one thing to hold a belief in the abstract. It is another to defend it to someone who is equally passionate in their opposition." "I understand the feeling," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I confess, you have forced me to reconsider certain positions." "Have I?" she asked, meeting his gaze. The sunlight caught the flecks of green in her hazel eyes. "Which ones?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I had always viewed the reformist position as stemming from a kind of naive idealism, a desire to fix what is not, in fact, broken. But you speak not of tearing down, but of building up. There is a pragmatism in your arguments that I had not anticipated." It was the closest he had come to praising her, not as a clever woman, but as a political thinker. Elinor felt a warm glow spread through her chest. This was more intoxicating than any victory in print. "And you," she replied, "are not the unfeeling reactionary I might have supposed. You argue from a place of deep love for your country, a desire to protect it. We simply disagree on what protection entails." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the intellectual admiration in his eyes was joined by something warmer, something more profound. "It is a rare thing," he said quietly, "to find someone who can disagree with you so fundamentally, and yet make you feel understood." The air between them crackled with unspoken admission. The line between adversary and ally was blurring, and in its place, something far more dangerous and alluring was beginning to form. The turning point came during a violent summer storm. The sky, which had been threatening all day, finally broke just as the party was returning from a picnic. The group scattered, running for cover. In the confusion, Elinor and William found themselves taking refuge in the one place they had both been unconsciously seeking, the Hartwell Library. It was a vast, circular room, 3 stories high, with a domed glass ceiling now lashed with rain. Books lined the walls, their leather spines glowing in the firelight that someone had thoughtfully lit. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and the damp, clean scent of the storm. They stood for a moment, breathless and laughing, dripping onto the Persian rug. Elinor's hair had come loose in damp tendrils around her face. William's coat was darkened with rain. "Well," he said, his eyes sparkling, "this is a rather dramatic end to the picnic." "It seems appropriate," Elinor replied, wringing out her skirt. "Our conversations have hardly been tranquil." He laughed, a rich, unrestrained sound that echoed in the quiet room. He moved to the fireplace, holding out his hands to the flames. "Come, warm yourself. You'll catch a chill." She joined him, the heat of the fire a welcome contrast to the dampness clinging to her skin. For a few minutes, they stood in comfortable silence, listening to the drumming of the rain on the glass above. "I have enjoyed our debates, Elinor," William said, his use of her Christian name sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "More than I can say." "As have I, William," she said, testing the sound of his name on her lips. It felt natural. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "It makes the world outside these walls seem complicated. My work in Parliament, the public debates, it all feels strangely distant when I am talking with you." Elinor's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm. This was the moment. The anonymity, the pretense, it all felt like a lie between them. She could not let this go further without him knowing. Without him knowing who he was truly talking to. "William," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there is something I must tell you. Our conversations, they are not as new as you might think." He frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "The arguments I have made, the positions I have defended, you are familiar with them. You have engaged with them before." She looked him directly in the eye, her own filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "In print." The change in his face was instantaneous. The warmth drained away, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. The quick mind that she so admired connected the dots with brutal speed. Her intellect, her passion, her political views. The way she argued, with a logic and clarity that had so reminded him of. "No," he whispered, taking a step back as if physically struck. "It cannot be." "I am Britannia," she said, the confession hanging in the air between them, as sharp and real as a shard of glass. William stared at her, his gray eyes wide with shock, then with a slow-burning anger. "You," he breathed. "All this time, it was you. You have been making a fool of me." "I have done no such thing," Elinor protested, her own fear giving way to indignation. "I have been honest with you in every conversation we have had here." "Honest?" he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You have been living a lie. You sat there, listening to me praise your work, debating with me, all the while knowing you were the very person I have been." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The person he had been fighting, the person he had been obsessing over, the person he had, in the quiet recesses of his mind, begun to fall in love with. "You were Cato," she stated, though it was no longer a question. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the picture it formed was one of devastating betrayal. "And you are Britannia," he said, the name sounding like an accusation. "The radical, the firebrand, the woman who would see everything I hold dear torn down. And you are the man who would see half the population kept in intellectual and political swaddling clothes for his own comfort." She shot back, the hurt and anger boiling over. "All those arguments, William, were they just a game to you? A drawing-room amusement? You spoke of my keen intellect, but the moment you discover it belongs to a woman who dares to challenge you in public, you recoil as if from a serpent." "It is not your intellect I recoil from, Elinor, it is your deceit," he thundered, his voice echoing in the vast room. You let me feel." He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "This changes everything." "Does it?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Does it change the validity of my arguments? Or does it only change your ability to dismiss them as the ramblings of an anonymous, and therefore safe, opponent? Now that I have a face, am I too real for you, William? Too human?" He had no answer. The storm of betrayal and hurt in his eyes was her only reply. He looked at her for one long, agonizing moment, at the woman who had captivated him and the adversary who had infuriated him, now tragically, impossibly fused into one. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the library, leaving her alone in the echoing silence, the fire her only companion. The war of words was over. A far more painful, personal battle had just begun. The rest of the house party was an exercise in exquisite agony. Where there had been easy conversation and lingering glances, there was now only a frozen, polite distance. Sir William was scrupulously courteous to Lady Elinor, but it was a courtesy that held all the warmth of a tombstone. He avoided her, immersing himself in conversations with the other men about hunting and politics, his laughter now sounding forced and hollow. Elinor felt his absence like a physical chill. The library, the walks, the drawing room, every space was haunted by the ghost of what might have been. She replayed their confrontation in her mind 1,000 times, each time feeling the same sharp twist of pain and anger. How could he dismiss everything they had shared because of a name? Because she was the one wielding the pen? George noticed the change. "What's happened between you and Devereaux?" he asked one evening as they played a desultory game of chess. "You were thick as thieves, and now you act as if the other has the plague." "We discovered a fundamental incompatibility," Elinor said, moving her bishop with more force than necessary. "Political, I assume?" George sighed. "I warned you, Nora. The man is granite on these matters. It's a shame. I rather liked him." "So did I," Elinor thought, her heart aching. "So did I." For William, the revelation was a cataclysm. The woman who had stirred feelings he hadn't felt in years was the embodiment of everything he fought against. He felt duped, his judgment clouded by a pretty face and a clever tongue. He tried to stoke his anger, to use it as a shield against the bewildering sense of loss. He threw himself into drafting a new pamphlet for Cato, a scathing indictment of Britannia's deceitful tactics and the dangers of hidden agendas. But the words felt hollow, poisoned by the memory of Elinor's face, her voice asking, "Does it change the validity of my arguments?" He couldn't write it. The fight had gone out of him. The anonymous war no longer held any appeal. The only adversary that mattered now had a name and a face, and he had irrevocably damaged any chance of a truce. The party was breaking up. Carriages were being called, trunks carried down the grand staircase. Elinor stood by the window in her room, watching the comings and goings below. She felt drained, emotionally spent. She had come to Hartwell for a diversion and had found a soulmate and an enemy in the same man. A soft knock came at her door. It was Sarah. "A note for you, my lady." "From Sir William." Elinor's heart leapt into her throat. She took the folded paper with trembling fingers. Was it more accusations? A final, bitter farewell? She opened it. The handwriting was strong and decisive, just like the man. "I cannot leave without attempting to bridge the chasm I created. My behavior in the library was that of a fool. I was shocked, and in my shock I was cruel. I accused you of deceit, when the truth is, I was deceiving myself. I told myself our debate was a purely intellectual exercise. I was wrong. The connection I felt with you was, and is, profoundly real. Discovering you were Britannia did not change the validity of your arguments. It gave them a power I was too cowardly to face. It is easier to argue with a phantom than with a person you have come to admire deeply. The world is not as simple as I have long believed. You have shown me that. I do not know if our two worlds can ever be reconciled, but I know that I cannot bear the thought of our last words being ones of anger. I will be walking by the lake before I depart. If you can find it in your heart to grant me a moment of your time, I would be eternally grateful. William." Elinor read the letter twice, tears welling in her eyes. It was not a surrender, but it was an olive branch. It was an admission of fault, and a recognition of her as an equal. It was everything she had hoped for, and nothing she had expected. Without a second thought, she picked up her shawl and hurried from the room. He was standing by the boathouse, looking out over the serene, sun-dappled lake, so different from the day of the storm. He turned as he heard her approach, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You came," he said, his voice low. "I did," she replied, stopping a few feet from him. "I meant every word in that letter, Elinor," he began. "I have been an arrogant, closed-minded fool. I was so committed to my idea of the world that I refused to see the world as it is. You have opened my eyes. He took a step closer. Cato and Britannia, they can continue their war if they wish. But William and Elinor, must they be enemies? Elinor looked at him, at the earnest plea in his beautiful, stormy eyes. The anger and hurt had melted away, leaving only a profound sense of what could be lost. I do not want to be your enemy, William, she said softly. Then what can we be? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached her eyes. We can be ourselves. Two people who disagree, passionately, on a great many things. But who respect each other too much to let those disagreements define them. We can be a challenge to one another. A source of strength, not conflict. He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. A formidable partnership, he said, a matching smile finally gracing his features. The most formidable, she agreed. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, his gaze never leaving hers. Then let the world have its anonymous wars, Elinor Hartwell. Our battle, he said, is over. Our conversation, I hope, is just beginning. And as they stood hand in hand by the quiet water, the anonymous adversaries finally laid down their arms, choosing instead the far more courageous and complicated path of understanding.